Hey there, this is Dan. You're watching the Salty Sea, and in my last video, which I will link down below and put a little card right up here, or is it up there? I actually don't remember. I promised that I would give you a little video on how to balance Warcry in 7 easy steps. Due to my life being turned upside down, having a kiddo recently, I wasn't able to get that out as quickly behind my last video as I wanted to. I wanted it to be like, bam, bam, 2 days later. But I'm glad that I was slow because GW just announced in their White Dwarf that they are doing a little bit of balancing point additioning for us. They are adding something to matched play called Divine Blessings. Now, you get to wait until after the battle plan is determined before you decide what your Divine Blessing is, but they're little add-ons that you can add to your list to sort of tweak the stats of some of your fighters. Some of these are very, very cheap. So, for example, Savagery, which is +1 crit damage, is only 10 points. Swiftness Reliance, if you use them on a cheap fighter, it's 15 points. The line between a cheap fighter, regular fighter for this, and elite is only 22 wounds, which is nice because that means most of the bespoke leaders fit under that, and most rank and file Stormcast fit under that. And those are very powerful fighters where, adding one move to them is very useful, or adding one strength or attack to them is very useful. Now, I do think that this is essentially what we are getting instead of a points update this summer. And that's okay. We kind of knew we wouldn't get an update. I talked in my last video about how it wasn't that big a deal that we weren't getting an update, because you could kind of argue that either we don't need one or maybe GW doesn't have the expertise to give us one right now. I do think it's a bit of a shame because the most powerful of these is Ferocity for only 30 points. You can add one to the attacks characteristic of a Gutlord, or another similar extremely high strength, high damage fighter. So Doom Bulls fall into this. The Ogroid Myrmidon falls into this. Just really fighters that are already really powerful, that for just 30 more points, you can just add an extra attack onto them. That's going to be sort of competitively, that's going to be the really powerful thing you do with this. The other situation will be, this is a nice little buff for people who had 15, 20 points left in their warband. 15 is sort of the magic number, especially for, say, Stormcast, something like that, where you can say at the beginning of the battle, all right, am I better off adding one move here, or am I better off adding one strength here to crack some armor somewhere else, right? Or you could even add one toughness. But keeping flexible like that, if you end your list at 985 points, is going to be a nice sort of techie way to play that's going to, I think, help out sort of the types of gamers who like to feel really, not necessarily, I don't want to say feel really clever in the moment, because that's kind of insulting and it's not how I mean it, but it's sort of jog their minds a little bit in the moment, if you want to sort of stay flexible as you play. I do enjoy that playstyle. I also enjoy the playstyle of just bringing a list that has a plan it's trying to execute every time. I enjoy that too, but you can really go either way with this, and I kind of love the flexibility there, even though I think from a balance perspective, I think this is a net negative on the game. So speaking of balance, let's talk about the 7 easy steps. Now, the first thing I'm assuming with this is that we're stuck with the models we've got. The second thing is I'm assuming that we are continuing to live in a world where there's sort of a wide variety of mission types. And the first issue is the slow baby horror show. The second is the interaction tax, something that not a lot of people talk about, so I'll explain that. The third is what is a buff worth? This is also something that I don't hear people talk about enough. Fourth is save the elves. We get a lot of grief on that one. 5 is counter questions, 6 is the cavalry confusion, and 7 is the mid-range trap. So let's just get right into it. First, I'm just going to talk real quick about how things get pointed. There's sort of a points algorithm, and then they round up or down based on the quality of the abilities. So for example, Gut Rippas and Savage Orcs have the exact same profile, but Gut Rippas are 75 points because Savage Orcs have access to charge, which is a much more powerful ability than anything in Gut Rippas. Though, personally, I prefer running Gut Rippas to Savage Orcs. Also, because of this, efficiencies are always going to be on the extremes because each stat is worth a certain amount. The thing that is not taken into account is how the stats interact with each other. So the middle 60% of fighters have been weak in Warcry for the game's entire existence because you either want to have very few stats around the board and cost very few points, or you want to have where each stat essentially compounds on top of itself. It also makes it so that the, quote-unquote correct way to build for a given battle plan is really similar for every faction because factions don't necessarily have strengths and weaknesses within the stats. So let's talk about the first step. Step 1 is fixing the slow babies. And by that I mean small move 3 fighters, chaff fighters essentially. They're all really ridiculous. They single-handedly ruined the Rumble Pack meta where it was, all objective missions, and people found out that once you just have swarms of these cheap move 3 fighters, it's over. They're also shockingly good in brawls. They're not busted in sort of center punch-up missions, things like that, hunter missions. They're not very good in those missions, but they are surprisingly okay. And the fact that they're so dominant on objectives and then less of a liability than they should be on those punch-up missions is kind of overwhelming. Cheap fighters that don't just get one-shot killed are really, really good in this game. GW has always sort of underestimated the value of an activation. Now, they did in the core book have missions that don't count until the end, which makes me think that they had been kind of thinking about that, thinking about how cheap fighters were really dominant for most of first edition. And those missions that don't score until the end are a lot better at mitigating the power of cheap fighters, but that's where these small move 3 fighters that are very, very cheap and too thick to one-shot kill. I'm thinking about things like KO Arcanauts, right, where they have 12 wounds, so it's not unreasonable to keep them alive until the end of the game. Those can be really, really difficult to deal with from a perspective of, you have missions where you score throughout the game. Even the missions where you don't score until the end of the game, it's not that big a deal. They're just very, very powerful. So how big a change is needed, though? I do think that the community is maybe misinterpreting how dominant these fighters are because of the fact that the community has been playing a lot of Rumble Pack where it's 3 objective missions in a 4-round tournament where the only thing that really matters is to load up on these guys and then just hope that when you play the one mission that isn't all about these guys that you just happen to be playing against someone else who is also loaded up on them. And so that's kind of creating a really skewed meta that isn't necessarily as indicative of what they would look like in a more balanced set of missions than they currently are in. But, it's still something that we need to deal with. There's also just a big difference between 40 and 50 points, right? So a lot of these fighters would go, if they had a 10-point increase, would go from being completely overwhelming to kind of unplayable. And that's just because 10 points is such a high percentage of the update here. So because I've got 6 other steps of things I'd want to change in the game, I'm taking a pretty light touch. Now, here's the list of all of the slow babies. You've got the Ironbreaker, Plague Bearers. Shatterers are the only move 4 thing to make it in here. Shatterers are absolutely ridiculous what you get for 55 points. And everything else is sort of the usual suspects other than Oziark Bone Reapers. Bone Reapers are completely ridiculous. It's just that nobody plays them. I don't know why. Soul-like Gravelords seem like they're getting destroyed from a ton of different fighters here, but that's because I've listed in 4 separate Underworlds fighters. I think Outlier Underworlds fighters are actually really fun and really kind of good for the game because you only get one of them, so it's not that big a deal, right? The problem is Soulblight Gravelords, if I didn't include Underworlds, there's four of them that are completely busted that are just way, way too good. And so that's getting to where you could just spam Underworlds fighters and do really well, even if, if we didn't touch those. So, I would like to see just 5 points brought up on Marshall Falk, Helmar, Thane, the Harvester. And if you're, really skeptical about this, I mean, Graveguards with big blades were very good, but not running things when they were 70 points. And that's kind of what I'm looking for what I want from these cheap move 3 fighters. Because again, the missions, changing the missions from being all objective missions all the time will hurt them, as is the fact that because they're move 3 fighters are kind of difficult to use. They do need to be somewhat overwhelming in combat to be playable. If a move 3 fighter is just sort of average or regular in combat, then you just can't play it at all. And we don't want that. We don't want all these move 3 fighters to just go away. That would be really unpleasant. But these small 5-point increments would really change what a list looks like once you've put 6 or 7 of these on the table. It would really, reduce your capabilities of what else you can do. And the idea is we're going to be buffing a lot of other fighters to sort of change the balance of power between them and this. So let's get into the next issue, and that's the interaction tack. You can kind of shorten this to say it's wizards that suck. Now, a lot of wizards suck that I'm not going to be talking about here. Now, the first thing is GW did try to fix this. All the wizards that were completely unplayable in first edition, they all got huge points drops. They just didn't quite go far enough for most of them. The issue, and I think the reason they didn't go far enough, is because if you drop the points on every wizard to make them playable, you kind of get into a bad situation. So most wizards that are in the game have really bad abilities, like abilities that are significantly worse than the combat regular fighters that don't have any magic. And so if you dropped the points enough on, say, a branch witch to make it good, or like a skink priest to make it good, it'd be awful gameplay because that magic blast of a 7-inch range, 2 attack, 3/6, if you could just spam the magic blast everywhere, for example, it would just be a really unfun game because that's a really swingy attack. When you just have one fighter and that fighter is a little overcosted and you're just bringing them for their ability and they've got that magic attack, that can be pretty fun in a game. But if you're sort of bringing like 6 wizards into play and it's just to be shooting things down, that gets really, really old really, really quickly. So I don't want to just drop the points on every wizard. I want to drop the points on the wizards that play an important role in a metagame. And what I mean by that is you need to have, in a game like this, abilities that interact with an opponent. And right now, nets are sort of the only playable way to disrupt your opponent's game plan in the course of a game. And there are a lot of abilities in the game that do that. They're just priced really poorly. And you know that they're priced really poorly because people aren't dabbling with these things. People aren't playing Swamp Kala Shamans and stuff like that. People aren't playing these sort of quote-unquote release valves, these things that... for example, good disruption is something that hurts certain warbands more than others. And so you can bring this piece that is, what some people would call a sideboard piece, but you're putting it in the main part of your list because a certain thing is so scary in the meta that you want to be able to be sure that you can deal with it. And having that out there can be really good. The other thing that can be really nice is just knowing that you might run into it with your skewed list. So if you bring a list that is only attacking in one way, that's more of a gamble now because there is something out there that counters you really hard. It's just an ingredient that allows players to self-regulate. And we don't have as many tools for this as I would like, to be honest. but there are a few. So I'd want to just drop the points, change the points on a few things to open up new playstyles without making control sort of the meta-defining approach in the game. I think it's a really bad idea when the strongest thing you can do is control things. So Askergen Trueblades are in an odd spot where, for example, their leader is really great, but actually running Askergen Trueblades as sort of a faction, like you buy 2 boxes and then you try to mix and match, is just really difficult to do. And so I think the Curse Blood and the Pariah are doing really interesting things. The Curse Blood has that really cool ability that shuts down reactions. Great Bray Shamans are already good enough, but just dropping the points a little bit to make it easier to build lists with them. I didn't want to do it much for GBS because they are already good, but people just aren't playing a ton of them, and I know people have them, so wanting to make it a little easier. Then getting into more wizards, right? The Wurgog Prophet, the Swampkala Shaman, some of these Stormcast wizards, the Infernal Enraptress and the Slanesh Shard Speaker. I'm wanting to bring them down a little because these are all wizards with really interesting disruptive abilities, whether it's, the Prophet and the Shaman with the -1 damage. The Knight Relictor has a really interesting, those have -1 attack. The Knight Relictor has subtracting damage from successful attacks. The Caligrave has -1 crit damage. Now that one I'm only dropping 5 here because it's already pretty cheap, and I wouldn't want it to be just spammable, but just that little bit of extra oomph that can help people put it into lists. Warcry points matter a lot more. I've heard people talk in, for example, AOS, a small points adjustment doesn't really make a lot of difference because 99% of the power in a faction is its abilities. It's in the, the various allegiance abilities and artifacts that they have access to. That's not the case in Warcry. We don't have allegiance abilities, really. We don't have, extra artifacts, things like that are faction specific and really impactful. All we have is the efficiency at our fingertips. And so points adjustments, even very small ones, make a much bigger difference over time than they do in other games that are more about allegiance abilities. So one last one that I like a lot is the Quester Prime. It has that 3 damage to everything around it ability. All of the Quester Soulsworn are overcosted, to be honest. They're all about 10 points too many. But this is the one that, to me, is like really emblematic of that. The others, at least at 165, are really interesting as far as their abilities to get extra activations both for themselves and for their allies. The Quester Prime can only bring it to an ally, and then this sort of area of effect attack it's interesting but not enough, and so bringing it down a little bit I think is important. The Lord Castellant has a really cool defensive ability, but at 195, only having 2 attacks, you just can't use it in lists. At 180, you'd hope that it'd be a little bit more. I was actually tempted to bring it down to 175, but that'll help. And then, of course, the defensive abilities on the Slanesh Wizards are really solid, but you just don't see people playing them. Whether that's because nobody plays Slanesh or not is who knows, right? The next thing that I notice a lot is that buffs are just all over the place with Warcry. Now, the first one, move buffs, do feel appropriate right now. Wah and all of the other things, Swift as the Wind, they're really good, but they are balanced. The free move doubles are really good, but they're not harming the meta. You're not seeing lists full of Fiend Bloods dominating everything. I think the only faction that you're seeing have a ton of success with that is Soulblight Gravelords, but that's not why. And then Ironjaws is having a lot of success with a free move double. And so I don't think that those are an issue right now, but buffs that buff attacks or strength are just completely skewed in terms of what the fighters who have them cost versus how effective the real buff is. Think about a Brew Git at 70 points. This is not a conditional ability. It's just +3 to a fighter. Go nuts. And that's crazy for a 70-point fighter to be holding an ability like that. You look at KO leaders that can sometimes give +2 attacks versus Skaven leaders. They used to be able to give +2 attacks. Now they cannot, and now they're sort of very awkwardly costed. They're costed as if they're supposed to be able to give a ton of attacks out, and they're not. So a lot of Skaven leaders are just really awful. And then you also have the Allurer at 125. I think this is a really interesting piece because it's not good at all. But it's got that strength buff, and I think it's paying a lot of points for it. When you look around at leaders, hero fighters that have access to a way to buff strength around them, they're almost all really bad. And the reason they're bad is because I think they're paying for that strength buff to be as effective as an attack buff, but it just isn't. If you look at, the best strength buff fighters in the game, like a Wrathmaster or something like that, giving them +1 strength, it often does not give as much attack or much bonus as giving an attack to a fighter of around the same points would. And it doesn't always matter, right? Strength only changes how much damage you're doing if it's specifically interacting with the opposing toughness. So strength buffs need to be cheaper, or for example, +2 strength, something like that, to really compare with attack buffs. Otherwise, they're just nowhere near as good. And so the fighters that have them need to be costed more aggressively than attack buff fighters in order to be playable. And so that's the reason why Slaanesh demon heroes just aren't very good, or like Nurgle Rotbringer heroes, despite a lot of them being slow move 3, they're just not very good, and Rotbringers aren't doing very well because they've got that strength buff. So there's a lot of shuffling here that I'm changing. The first, 3 Slaanesh demon fighters, 2 Nurgle Rotbringer fighters that I'm changing up. The Lord of Blights is just way worse than the Lord of Plagues. They both cost 170 points. They both have a melee attack. The difference is the Lord of Blights has a really bad ranged attack that is just awful and almost unusable. And the Lord of Plagues does not, but it has a much better melee attack than the Lord of Blights does. And by ranged attack, I mean ranged ability. And so I just want to drop the points on the Lord of Blights so that the Plagues and Blights actually have different purposes now. So the Lord of Blights can be a cheaper leader that, gives out a buff, and the Lord of Plagues can be, you're paying 10 extra points for a little more damage there. I'm also just adding a little bit just across the board to all the Caradhran Overlords leaders. Some of them are much better than others. For example, company captains are really, really good right now because they're just such a cheap way to have Fight for Profit active. But all of them just need a little bit more. I didn't have a very heavy hand here because I'm also adding points to a bunch of stuff in KO because, you're seeing Arcanauts in a previous section go up. And so just every little section of the KO army going up just a tiny bit, it adds up quite a bit over time. I also just had a really tough time deciding what to do with Skaven. Skaven are really beloved in their current incarnation. A lot of people really love their Rat Ogre lists, but the internal balance on Skaven is a mess. And Rat Ogre lists and Stormfiend lists are a total mess in that, Skaven has a very middling win rate in competitive play. But if you play with or against Skaven, there are certain missions where you just don't have a chance if you're playing against them. And there are a lot of missions where they don't have a chance if they're playing against you. And it's just not a great place to be. So I'm kind of leaning towards, adding a few points for the really big beefy things. Rat Ogres should be going up 10 points. Stormfiends should be going up 10 points. But then some of the really terrible leaders, like Bringer of the Word, Fang Leader, Arch Warlock, Claw Lord, these are leaders that nobody is taking, that are paying a lot of points for having lead from the back. They should all be going down. And that's just to kind of change the incentives for what you're going to do with your Skaven list. I also had a real think about whether you want to nerf the caster or the target in certain situations. For example, in Brugits and Gutlords, nerfing the hell out of both because it's incredibly powerful, and we're seeing this new points change. I actually had the nerfs being a lot smaller and not the crusher here, but the new sort of points addition changes allowing you to just add an attack to a fighter for 30 points. Gutlords with that are completely broken, as are the Grinder Fist Storm Fiends, which is part of why they're going up 10 points here. I just don't think that they're very healthy for the game in the situations where they're good. These certain skewed profiles, they combo with buffs so much, and the way that GW costs attack buffs are just so zeroed in on what it's like to give an attack buff to a 4-4-2-4 fighter, and these sort of 6 strength 5-10 fighters are just absurd with it. But overall, just kind of a complete reshuffling of how much a buff is worth is really needed, because costing strength buffs the same as attack buffs is just very, very silly. Now, a thing that a lot of people complain about is that elves are just terrible in all their iterations. And the reason for that is that 8 wounds and toughness 3 is a really untenable place to be. Those fighters just die so quickly to just one attack. They almost never survive 2. And then also 10 wounds, if you cost around 100 points, is also a complete disaster. The elf stat line is this sort of 5 move, usually does pretty respectable damage, but costs a lot of points and has zero ability to survive, and it's just impossible to use in Warcry. They are okay in hunter missions, things where you have to run over to something and kill it. If you have a lot of expendable fighters that just each run over, get an attack in, then you have to waste an activation to kill them, that can be really useful to have, but that type of mission is very, very rare. And even in those, fragile fighters are not amazing because, they take the damage back, right? So there's really no situation right now where elves are in an okay place. And so I think there's a pretty wide variety of them that you need to buff quite a bit. Now, this change does make me a little nervous because a lot of these are cheap fighters where -5 points is a really big difference. Witch elves are just really bad right now. They're really struggling at 65 points. But at 50 points, they'd be, if not the best, they'd be one of the best fighters in the game, right? And they might be overpowering at 60 points. I don't know. I don't think they would be. But that's why I have such a light touch on a lot of these. But some of them, especially some of the more expensive ones, you can really go down all the way down 10 points. Like Wildwood Rangers. Now, we did just learn that Cities of Sigmar are getting rid of all these Wanderers, but they'll be in Warcry for at least 2 more years. These Wildwood Rangers are just so killable that even 10 points might not be enough to really make them competitive, which the idea is not to make every fighter you change competitive. It's enough. The idea is to make them sort of attractive in casual games. Competitive play is its own thing. And balance updates are meant to fix competitive play, but that should only be, a half or even less than half of what the idea is. So you can see a ton of stuff based on where all the elves are in Cities of Sigmar and Daughters of Cain. But I also have some reduced points here on some elf-like things like stuff from Corvus Cabal or Skaven. Every fighter on this list is kind of hot garbage right now. And some of these are sort of bespoke factions like Tarantula's Brood that really need help. Or like Gloomspite Gits are pretty good, but you never see regular fanatics in there. I think all of these changes sort of as a group would really help some of the elf and elf-like factions compete in a way that they really can't now. Also, the Chain Rasp pays so much for its movement and is so killable, costs 85 which is a lot, and it makes it really hard to build lists in Nighthaunt. So bringing it to 75, I think, is something that Nighthaunt players really, really need. Now let's get into counter, which is a thing that I don't think people necessarily think about the right way. Counter is good gameplay. I didn't like it at first, but the fact is, it is interesting. It sort of being able to punish an attacker who just comes in and smacks you off the field, being able to just do something about that is really nice. At least with the core book, a lot of changes had been made to really benefit elite fighters. Those were undone in some of the later updates that we got over this edition, but having your chaff be able to defend itself a little bit is a really nice little gameplay wrinkle there. The problem is, and it really hurts mid-cost fighters, because think of it this way: both elite and mid-range fighters don't have control over action-reaction play, right? Because the chaff is always going to be able to control the sort of action-reaction game. Elite fighters don't really mind that much, though, because they just vaporize whatever chaff they touch. So they don't really mind that much that the chaff that they're going to attack has an ability to react to them and disrupt them, because they're just so powerful. They're working with so many things that they just walk in and just destroy whatever they touch, just absolutely vaporize everything. So counter can hurt them, but it's really not a deal breaker. It doesn't affect them that much. However, mid-range fighters, say something with a 4-3-2-4 profile, so 3 strength, but a decent number of attacks, does decent damage when it hits. Against a Plague Bearer, you're going to average 4 damage when you attack it, and on average you're taking 3.33 back. To a 50-point fighter on your 120-point fighter that's supposed to be kind of a blender at that points cost, it's not tenable, right? I've seen this happen so many times, especially with Elves, but I've seen it happen so many times with mid-range fighters, especially the ones that are supposed to be really killy, where they just swing into something and they just kill themselves when they attack. Because the fact that every fighter in the game has access to counter means it's everywhere, and you just can't escape when you're playing fighters that cost a lot and are vulnerable to this. Really, any fighter over 80 points that's liable to suicide by counter is just completely unplayable unless it's sort of doing something really, really special out there. For example, a good example, the 4-3-2-4 profile is on the Slaanesh Painbringer, but Painbringers are doing a whole host of other things. They've got toughness 5, they've got 15 wounds. They're actually really tanky, and so then they're there to do something else. They don't mind not being very offensive, and they'll just try to avoid fighting chaff. Things like that are okay, but anything whose job is to play offense, if you're over 80 points, you just can't do it if counter hurts you. And that's a huge swath of the meta. Look at all these fighters that just cost a lot of points and just suicide into counter. As soon as they touch something that has a higher toughness, even just a regular toughness 4, as soon as they touch something cheap with toughness 4, they just evaporate themselves. I do have some elites here, so I know I said that elites don't care as much, but this has sort of created a situation where fighters that have elites that have 3 attacks and a ton of damage per attack are just doing way better than factions that have elites that have a lot of attacks, for just a variety of reasons. You can't kill their chaff as fast as they kill yours because their chaff attritions you down, and then their leader can just walk over and kill your leader because you're nearly dead and theirs isn't. So I've got some elites here, but for the most part, we're just really going down, and all of these sort of middle cost, a lot of these are high middle cost fighters. All of them just need to go way down to be okay, because just the trade-offs that you get when you deal 1,000,000 damage to yourself with these fighters is just untenable. And you can see, again, it's a lot of the worst factions in the game that are appearing here a lot, right? Nighthaunt is really doing terribly. Cities of Sigmar, when it's not running Dispossessed, doing really terribly. Daughters of Cain needs a ton of help with this. Doc and Nighthaunt do have other problems, but Counter is a big reason why those two factions are unplayable right now. We've sort of dealt with Daughters of Cain's glass issues in the Elves section. Same with Nighthaunt, actually, with their chain rasps. But now we have to get some of their sort of more offensive, not chaff pieces into playability as well. And that's kind of where we get into this step. You also see a lot of bespoke factions represented here, with the Chaos Legionnaire, the 3 different Cypher Lords, Dark Oath Savagers, Splintered Fang here, because it is just a very common issue with the bespoke factions to have these middle-of-the-road fighters with kind of a lot of attacks, but they're not really hitting very hard per attack. They really, really struggle, and so I think a lot of the reason people are down on some bespoke factions is because their mid-range fighters just can't do anything against chaff. And so that needs to change a little bit. I think some of the value propositions for those factions need to change a little bit. And some of these changes will also make them legitimately much easier to list build with. For example, Khainite Shadowstalkers, if they could get that Shroud Blade with swords to cost a lot less, would just be able to do much more interesting lists. And I think that's important. Cavalry is kind of funny in this game. You really don't see a lot of cavalry on the table. In fact, you barely see any cavalry on the table, considering how huge a percentage of the fighters you're allowed to play in Warcry are cavalry. Now, I wouldn't want to have a huge heavy touch with cavalry because balancing it's really hard. It's sort of a microcosm of, or sort of an extreme example of the issues that GW has had generally with their linear points algorithm. The first being, okay, reach has value. A 1 wound, move 10 fighter would be a legitimately good piece that you would pay real points for in any list. Like, I could see someone paying 50 points for a 1 wound, move 10 fighter in a faction that doesn't have other options for speed. Power projection also has a lot of value. The bigger a fighter is, the more valuable it is to have an extra point of speed to deliver that sort of power across the board. And so that's where the two efficiencies are with cavalry, is the really cheap, fast stuff. I'm thinking about dire wolves. I think a lot of people swear by them. Or, little birds. A lot of people will sometimes play one of those in lists. And the really heavy stuff, like a Varengard, is also pretty valuable. But everything in between is just really, really bad because it's not getting to either of those sections, and it's just not efficient enough on its own. Now the question is, do we want to reduce the points on cavalry so much that you get all cavalry warbands? I don't know what the gameplay for that would be like, though in a lot of missions that's a pretty big liability given that you can't climb very easily with cavalry. So I don't think it's that big a deal, but I did want to just drop the points on just sort of a little array of some of the mid-range cavalry in the game, stuff that generally costs quite a bit for the combat power that you're getting. Things like the Harbinger of Decay, which was already nerfed to 185, or sorry, buffed to 185 in a different section, but here it is getting buffed to 185 again. But things like, for example, we're nerfing so much out of Soulblight Gravelords, but you just never see the regular Blood Knights on the table, and that's really too bad because they could be so interesting. So getting them down quite a bit, I think, is important. Things like the Hound of Wrath in Claws of Karanak, that is a faction that you do not see people play ever, right? Gloomspite, you see the leaders, right, because of what we talked about, how the more expensive, harder hitting fighters are better, but you never see regular Squig Riders. And so they really need to come down a little bit. Most light cav was actually on the counter list. You see a lot of cavalry that the reason it's unplayable is they've got 4 attacks, but none of their attacks do anything, and you're paying a ton of points. Those were on the previous list generally. I also had a couple really notable bits of cavalry that I don't think should be buffed, even though it kind of fits the profile. Frost Sabers. Ogres have so many options already, including things with free moves, stuff like that, that buffing Frost Sabers a ton could be really dangerous. And also Horse Archers. If Horse Archers were really good, I think a lot of things in the game would break down. So I didn't include any Horse Archers in this list. Finally, we have our 7th and final step to balance all of Warcry, and that's the Midrange Trap. We just don't see consistent, successful lists that are spamming mid-range non-Stormcast fighters in any type of mission format. You can't do it in objective missions because you end up with 8 or 9 fighters and you just lose because you can't kill anything fast enough. And you can't do it in sort of really brawl, kill, hunter missions, things like that, sort of fightier missions, because the elites just still kind of bowl through you, and you just don't bring enough things that can take down those really elite fighters. Also, a lot of the things that we've already talked about, if you look at what we were fixing, it was all mid-cost fighters. In the counter section, those were almost all mid-cost fighters. There were some elites there. In the cavalry section, it was all mid-cost stuff. In the interaction tax section, those were all sort of mid-size wizards and priests with interactive abilities that just aren't good enough because they cost too many points. They can't clear chaff off the table enough at their points costs, and they have too hard a time surrounding and out activating elite fighters at their points costs. So I've already changed 100 mid-range fighters to get huge buffs in this video, but this section is not just for those that are being hurt by a specific metagame issue, but where they're just extra mid-range. And by that I'm talking about all-around fighters. Fighters that are meant to do a little bit of everything. They're meant to play offense and defense and kind of have these hybrid roles. A fighter usually needs a role to be good, and fighters with hybrid roles need to just be really undercosted and efficient to be able to really do anything effectively. So a lot of, for example, the Chaos Warrior equivalents are in that boat of being sort of a little bit of offense, a little bit of defense. They're not move 3, they're move 4, so they can get around the board a little. They're just too all around, and they cost too many points. So even at 105 points, the Pit Vet from Spire Tyrants is just too many. The Ascended one from the Unmade is just too many points. That one especially is pretty fragile. The Zangor with Great Blade, I've played with those quite a bit. Those just feel like a huge waste of time when you're playing with them. Things like Bestigors and Phoenix Guard, you see people try to make Bestigor work. They never quite get there. There's just a lot of those sort of Chaos Warrior sized things that are just not working right now. And Chaos Warriors themselves. The other step to fixing the mid-range trap is there are 4 fighters, really 5, but we already nerfed Gutlords. There are a few fighters in the game that just single-handedly, by themselves, invalidate every mid-range footslogger in the game. And so those need to all come up before you really get to where mid-sized fighters can do much. Now, something like a Tyrant, you actually don't see those a ton. I think the reason for that is because Gutlords do the exact same thing for 30 fewer points, 35 fewer points. But they are just really prohibitive, and the fact that now they're introducing these sort of force multipliers that you can pay points for means that Tyrants need to come up. They actually weren't on here before until I saw that new update from GW yesterday. Chimeras, on some level, they are unsafe at any speed. If Chimeras were 800 points, I could bring one to a tournament with a 150 point hero and a 50 point chaff model, and those are my 3 deployment groups, and I would win some games. I would not, I would even think I could maybe go 2-2 with it. The ideal thing would be to ban the Chimera from Warcry, but there's this other thing of you just can't really play with it much if it really goes above even where it is now. It's really awkward. There's only a couple factions that can even fit it into a list. So I think just bringing it up 85 more points, I think is a really important step to start with the Chimera. That would really hamstring what the current competitive Chimera lists look like against other competitive lists. I think that at 600 points, Chimeras would still be very scary in casual play, but I think that they would be a lot less. Your ability to win a tournament with a Chimera would go way down. And once people can't really win tournaments with them, how many people are still going to play it is, I think, a great question. And then, of course, Thunderers, almost everything in KO I'm pushing up in points, but Thunderers in particular really excel at just blowing mid-range fighters off the board. You can just, in one attack, kill a fighter that costs the same amount of points as you. It's absolutely absurd. So I think the Aether Cannon Thunderer absolutely needs to go up 10 points while all the other things at that point cost all go down 10 points. I think that's really important. And then the Mortar is just really good as well, and so should also go up a little. These are smaller points increases than I think you would maybe expect, given what I just said about that they can just one-shot kill things that are the same size as, same points cost as them. But everything else in KO is also going up in points. So basically the entire list is losing, 60 to 80 points in the list. And so that's quite a bit over time. Otherwise, you can see a ton of these adjustments to mid-size fighters. And let me just scroll through kind of the entire list here. So I'm coming back 4 or 5 days after having recorded the first chunk of the video that you just saw, and I'm going to take a look at the entire population. This is about 150 fighters. That's about 10% of the fighters in Warcry, and I've got them sorted by faction here. And it's worth, I think, we're looking at the whole group and kind of reflecting, because doing this actually made me have a lot more respect for the people who do try to balance these games. It can be really hard when you change one thing, you look at something else in the game that's now, that was kind of on par with it, that's now not as good, and you have to think about, is there a justification for why those are now imbalanced with each other? I think there should be lots of the time, right? Ideally, the pieces that are the most fun to play with should be the most powerful on the board. That obviously is a complicated thing to make happen, but not everything should be equally powerful in the game. That's why I haven't gone in and buffed all the archers, for example. I've played games with archers that were overpowered in Warcry, and it wasn't fun. But I do think it's really helpful to go through these little chunks to see kind of what we're creating here for each faction. For the True Blades, not a ton of builds would change, but the Curse Blood and the Pariah are both kind of the interactive pieces that you get in that faction, and this would sort of encourage you to play that sort of style, encourage you not to cut these two, and if you're going to bring something else in, cut some of those throat takers, something like that. Now, those you could have potentially argued should fall under the mid-range, mid-roll models. They're sitting at 95 points. You could definitely argue to drop them to 90 points. I don't think you'd want to drop them, based on kind of some of their other stats, I don't think you'd want to drop them to 80, 85, because at that point spamming them would be a pretty annoying little list, especially the range 3 ones. But they are a little expensive as they are now. True Blades are so interesting because their leader is so great But either way, we can't spend this much time on every single faction. Beasts of Chaos are already in a great place, but Bestigor are sort of hard to use, and the Great Bray Shaman, it is good. People do like it, but it's it's just not very efficient in what it does. You know, the Slaughter Priest with the Great Axe is its own one-piece combo. So with a Great Bray Shaman, you really have to have other fighters in your list. So even though 5 points might not sort of unlock brand new builds, it just makes it a tiny bit easier to fit into a list. Uh, Gets a little bit more point spread away from a Slaughter Priest as far as usually at 145 versus 190. It's like, why not just add 45 more points if you're allying in a Great Bray Shaman? So just trying to increase that spread just a tiny bit. Bone Splitters players are generally happy with where they are. You just have that the foot slogging leaders are the only way to go there. So the Prophet and the Boarboy Maniac would kind of open up a few new playstyles if you just kind of made them a little more attractive to take. Chaos Legionnaires, in the first video, I've added a few fighters here that kind of made more sense once I looked at everything. Only about 10 total. But Legionnaires are one of them. In the early section, I was only changing the first Horn Shield. I think as a whole class, I think they're all kind of overcosted and need kind of a rethink. And at this level, one being 85, one being 90, one being 95, I would say that is the sort of the range of how powerful each of them is. You know, the mace being the best, the axe, then the sword being the worst one. And so having them each have a different points value kind of makes you think about which one you're wanting to take, which sorts of trade-offs you're willing to make, because, you know, at 95 points, I think it's really hard to justify the sword over the axe, for example. And so now each of them being a little bit cheaper and just sort of being a little bit more playable would, I think, really help Chaos Legionnaires and be really nice. Cities of Sigmar, you could have, of course, argued to take down a couple of the other dispossessed fighters by a few points, but overall, Dispossessed are really strong, but they're not sort of breaking the game strong. They're just strong. And so I would hate to nerf them into the ground. I think Iron Breakers are kind of the silliest extension of what Dispossessed do. And so adding 5 points to those and leaving the rest seems okay to me, but, you know, your mileage could vary on whether you agree there. I think the important thing with Cities of Sigmar is to really free up some of the elves for you to take, and because there's just so many bad ones out there. So this brings down the costs on a lot of different elves, which should hopefully make those a little bit more playable, a little bit less heartbreaking when you lose one. I know, you know, losing a 90-point executioner is still going to be pretty heartbreaking, but at least, you know, you're going to have one or two more models in your lists at these points costs, and so that would be really nice and sort of really help them out again. The same being true with their cavalry. You know, we do have at least one human here now in the cavalry, but none of their cavalry are particularly attractive to take. And while I would never want to see all cav warbands, I don't think that that would be an issue with such a small points decrease here. The Hound of Wrath, Claws of Karanak need more help than this, but at least getting, you know, the thing all of their abilities sort of ask you to do is combo around the Hound of Wrath, and you can't take two in a list. So here you go. At 175, it's a little easier to do that. Corvus are another one. I thought about dropping the price on the leader, but that's kind of a whole separate issue. The leader is not very good, but at least making the chaff cheaper would kind of give you something else you can do, especially because at the moment you don't really want to play any of the chaff other than the 80-point spear one. And so at least this way now you have real reasons to choose one or the other. Dropping anything down to 60 points does make me worry a little, but, you know, it's tough, right? Because Caballists with Dagger at 65 and Witch Elves at 65, they're just not a factor in games right now. And so, man, 60 is starting to get scary low, but I think in certain cases, I think it's worth experimenting with that. Cypher Lords, you know, you would get 30 points back in kind of the main combo list here unless you were using glaives, in which case you would get 20 points back. But that would give you a lot more room to take an interesting ally in your Cypher Lords lists, and that would really help. Dark Oath Savagers, I added some of the proven under these kind of mid-range, mid-roll fighters. They really are just all about 5 points too expensive. That's kind of a theme with Dark Oath, is just everyone who fights is just a little bit too expensive, other than the leader, who's pretty good. So, this would give you a lot more room to lean into what Dark Oath is supposed to do, which is run the guys who are meant to get in there and fight, and then use just the future abilities just for them, right? Having a little bit more flexibility because you probably got one more of them on the table. Daughters of Cain needed so much help, and I do wonder if even this would be enough to save them in this edition. But there are a lot of decreases here. All of their chaff options getting decreased a little bit. Some leaders are getting decreased. A couple of the more interesting fighters, as far as life takers and blood sisters, the more interesting melee fighters for them, going down quite a bit. I think Daughters of Cain might need more than that, but I think it would be reckless to, especially with the fast ones, with how much speed they have. The line, if you go too far, is really rough. So I would want to see what they look like at these kinds of lower points costs, potentially making it a lot easier to get maybe 2 blood sisters into a list, something like that. Sort of making them a little bit more playable, and hopefully making it a little bit less heartbreaking when one of them takes a bajillion damage to counter. Demons of Khorne, you can't save them with points. They're one of the only factions in the game. In general, I think in Warcry, it's not like AOS where, the points don't matter compared to the Allegiance abilities. I did mention this before, but our points are important, but Demons of Khorne are one of the very few exceptions where you just can't save them with points. The best I think you could do is just drop 5 on Fleshhounds and Bloodletters. But because, if Bloodletters have enough beef to them that they would be broken at, say, 65, right? You could say 70, but then even at 70, it's like you're just spamming them to have them, and they're still not an interesting piece because they've got that anti-synergy. Demons of Nurgle, the real change, Plague Bearers, spamming them around the board, that is powerful, but the real change that needs to happen to Demons of Nurgle is to make the Chimera harder to run. So at that point, the lists that are, terrifying people at tournaments, I think that would be a lot less of a problem. Plague Bearers are broken on objective missions, but, like I said at the top, we should be having fewer objective missions in our tournaments anyway. There should never be a tournament with 3 objective missions out of 4. And so at that point, Plague Bearers become a little bit less useful, and so I think it's much more reasonable to have them at 55. I think at 60, Demons of Nurgle would be almost unplayable as a faction because they just don't have much else going for them. And that's why, even though they are the highest win rate faction in the game, I wanted to drop 10 points off of Beasts of Nurgle because that is such a cool fighter, and you just never see it taken because you can just get too much for the same price, right? A Beast of Nurgle costs the same as 3 Plague Bearers right now. You're just never going to make that trade-off. And so it'd be nice to see sort of more of a reason to take that fighter. Demons of Slaanesh might need a little bit more help than this, but the problem is nobody plays Slaanesh, so we'll never know. The thing that I know that they need help on is just a few more interesting leaders, and so the Allurer is already so cheap, I don't want to drop it very much, but Vice leaders, the Contorted Epitome, and the Infernal Enraptress, all going down 10, I think would sort of make your choices for what you kind of want to lead your list a lot more interesting. The Vice leader is sort of a jack of all trades, not normally the type of model that's any good in Warcry, so I think dropping it 10 points to make it from sort of a master of none to something that can kind of fill different niches in a game would be nice. And then the Epitome probably needs to go down even more from 210 to 200, but at 10-inch move and very serious amounts of damage, at that point, once you start bringing it down into the 200 range, you're starting to look at just as a pure assassin piece maybe being too valuable. So really tough to say what Demons of Slaanesh are sort of in the meta because no one plays them, but they definitely have those overcosted leaders, and so you can at least fix that. Crypt Infernals, there's just no reason to play them over the Vargulf Courtiers because that is just a far better fighter, so dropping 10 points on it I think is necessary. Flesh Eater Courts are really good right now, but, you know, not with Crypt Infernals. Gloomspite Gits have a really terrible win rate other than Peter Merce and Cabbage, right? So just nerf the things that Peter uses too much and buff everything else. I'm joking, of course. I'm really, really impressed with the way he pilots that faction, but the fact is their win rate outside of him is in the low 30s, maybe high 20s. And I think a lot of it is because there's so many things that are really tempting to take that are just a little overcosted. So dropping points here and there I think are really necessary. And so things like, you know, you want to be running lists with lots of squigs, but you run out of room so quickly. And so just getting, you know, 30 points back in a list that's going to run 3 squigs in it, I think is a really nice thing to do to allow you to get one more chaff fighter in there if you're kind of massaging things right. And hopefully would make sort of jankier Gloomspite lists a little bit more interesting depending on how they're built. Horns of Hashut, this is really the only issue. I don't think the Flamethrower would be an issue on non-objective mission tournaments, but you know, we'll have to test that over the course of the next 6 months. Idnet Deepkin, of course, need a ton of help, maybe more help than this, but just freeing up players to make lists a little bit more easily just by adding, you know, taking a few points out here would be really nice. They are a weird faction with one incredible fighter and everything else is just too difficult to fit or take. So they definitely need more help with this on some of their other leaders, but this would be just really huge for them to just give them some playability. K-Knight Shadowstalkers are already good and also completely unplayable at the same time based on whether you're willing to spam a single good fighter. This gives you a second good fighter, so maybe just 2 boxes of K-Knight Shadowstalkers could get you a pretty playable list, and I don't think this would make the very best lists you make with them any more oppressive than they could be. I mean, nobody plays them that way because it's impossible to collect, so it's not really something to worry about. Caradron Overlords, of course, I have said in many videos that they are the best faction in the game. I am nerfing everything because of that. I gave this whole list to my Discord, and one of the things that I think someone pointed out is, in some cases, bringing in a Fight for Profit soup leader is only going up 5 points, and so that doesn't seem like it changes order soup at all. I haven't seen a ton of order soup lists that really make me really nervous about the format. They are good, but they are not sort of necessarily as meta defining good right now as you would fear. And so the ones that are only going up 5 points are the Navigator and the Gunnery Sergeant, and I have never once seen someone take either of those 2 fighters. You almost always either see the Company Captain for the cheapest option, or then you see some of these you know, basically these 3 are the ones you see, and those I would all put up 10 points, and the Company Captain I would put up 15, just to make it a little bit harder to fit them into lists, make you work a little bit more, sacrifice a little bit more stuff, something like that. Overall, I wouldn't want to just legislate KO out of the game, so that's why you're not seeing sort of massive hits, but you are going to be losing about 50 points out of your most lists in this sort of configuration, maybe more than 50 points, maybe something like 60, 75 points. And that's good. That's one whole less Arcanaut to have to chew through to get to the combo, or, you know, one Thunderer turned into an Arcanaut, so now there's less, you know, giant guns shooting at you, something like that. And I think with some of the buffs that I'm giving to faster factions, that would kind of recontextualize KO in the meta anyway because they're the ranged faction. And so people who can close with them would be getting a lot better and getting played a lot. And so I don't think massive nerfs to KO are necessarily the way to go, but I do think everything in the faction needs to be nerfed a little bit. Khorne Bloodbound have really good stuff going on, right? They've got those Blood Reavers, they got Korgoraths, but the things that are in between a Blood Reaver and a Korgorath are really struggling. And like, for example, the Slaughter Priest with the Wrath Hammer and the Hack Blade is just worse than the other Slaughter Priest. And so it really needs to come down to give it kind of a differentiated role where the 195 point Slaughter Priest can be the, this is a one just sort of he just stands there, he does his thing, he's a one-man combo, pulling things everywhere, being able to fight them and really blow them up after you've pulled them. And then the Wrath Hammer and the Hack Blade can be the one where, you're pulling them and maybe you can survive a couple rounds in a fight with them, but you're not just pulling and assassinating all in one go. And so now there's kind of actual gradations between the big Slaughter Priest, the small Slaughter Priest, and then the Great Bray Shaman if you're sort of trying to ally in a pull into your Chaos lists. And I think that would be really important to see. I'd really like that. Otherwise, it's just all the medium fighters need to go down a lot to sort of accurately reflect how good they are within the context of Khorne. Especially the Wrathmonger and the Skull Reaper. I'd like to see people actually play them. You never see them on the table, which I think is a real shame. Cruel Boys are already in a great place, so I didn't want to do much other than just give them a couple more leader options to give them new play styles. Now, another one of the first things was, why are we only going -5 on these Killabosses? Is that really opening up any other lists for Cruel Boys? Probably not, and then it's not going to make it so that you take a Killaboss over a Brute Boss in a list because you're still going to want you messing. All of that is completely accurate, but here's one of the funny things about changing points, right? I just put them -5 because that brings them in line efficiency-wise with what the curve is supposed to be. Killabosses are already good, in my opinion. Whenever I write a Cruel Boys list, I always start with the Killaboss with Haka and Flail. The thing is, it is just the teeniest bit overcosted as far as sort of what the curve for that type of fighter normally is, and so bringing it down 5 points puts it in line with what everyone else pays for that much sort of attacking power and beef. Not every change is made to specifically enable a specific list to now exist. And that really made me think a lot about how sometimes when GW makes a bunch of points changes and people look at a points change and they go like, that's ridiculous, that's not doing anything. Sometimes really all you're doing is like, oh, like that's a knob that is in the wrong spot, that should be here. Maybe it changes things, maybe it doesn't. I actually do find when I'm making Destruction Soup that I'm like really racking the last 20 points in the list and like flipping things all around to I pretty much always end up at exactly 1,000 points. So I actually do think that -5 on the Killaboss would let you do something else kind of interesting, but it really changed my perspective on evaluating whenever GW makes a change because I 100% agree with the person in my Patreon. And let me just, if you like this kind of content, please join my Patreon. We talk about the really granular stuff in there, and it can be really fun. So I 100% agree with the person in my Patreon who said that -5 points on the Killaboss doesn't make a lot of sense, and so that kind of made me think a lot about GW and how they do things. Lumineth Realm Lords are also one of those where like they're in a very good place, but only if you spam very specific things. So some of the stuff that isn't being spammed needs a little bit of help. And because Lumineth Realm Lords, when you take a little bit of everything, are really awful. And part of that is Blade Lords are just a liability. Having more than one Dawn Rider is a real problem. And so I wanted to kind of make those a little bit more attractive choices. The Caligrave, there are other leaders that are much worse than the Caligrave in Lumineth, but the Caligrave just has that interactive ability where um, I think that you want to be encouraging people to take those abilities. So even though it's already good, I swear that it's good. Um, I've played it a little bit and it's solid, but it should be even more attractive. And so I think -5 points on it, maybe even -10 in the future. But man, it starting at 110 points, it starts being like I'm only changing this, taking this because it's cheap, and so I wouldn't want to see that. But I do want to just encourage people to try that play style, and so I think -5 points would be a really nice change there. Night Haunt needs so much help. I do think that this would do it for them, would help them out quite a bit. Where, Chain Rasps being at 85 just makes list building for Night Haunt so difficult because you just don't want to take them at that price. Um, they need a lot of the things that people aren't really taking right now to be a lot cheaper. I think, the Banshee is generally the thing that I think is what you'd want to take a lot of at a list right in a list right now. So that one I didn't buff up much, but everything else around it I think just needs so much help. So right now, really all I would ever want to take in a list would be Banshees and Spirit Hosts. So that means everything else needs to come down, and so that's what I've kind of done here. Nurgle Rotbringers, just differentiating those leaders, right? The Lord of Plagues being 170 for an incredible fighting piece means the Lord of Blights, who for some reason is 170 with a trash ability and no ability to fight, should be cheaper. And then the Harbinger of Decay is a much worse fighter, but is fast now. So, you kind of make more of a trade-off there. But at 195, you just never want to take it over the Lord of Plagues or the 145 point guy. Those are really the only two you would take right now, is at 145, 170, and 320. And so I just wanted to kind of create some more interesting steps there. Ogre Maw tribes are in a really cool place, but their main three really good leaders just make for weird, wonky, uninteractive games. So they should just be a little bit more expensive. Is this going to change the average ogre's list? No. But it changes the math a little on Destruction Soup, which I think is important. And it's just, bringing things efficiency-wise more in line with how they should be. A lot of things that they prey on are going down in points, so then them going up in points just very subtly changes the balance of power over time. Ossiarch Bone Reapers, it's really just about Mortek are too good in objective missions, and these Harbingers with swords are just worse than the halberds right now, in my opinion. And also, in general, you don't really want to bring Morghast over Stalkers, and so hopefully bringing some of them down 10 points makes you want to do that. Stormcast, I could have done a lot more nerfs, but Stormcast are just in a really great place as long as you're not doing tournaments with a bunch of objective missions, and so I don't really want to change too much with that. Just bringing down some of the leaders with really cool abilities. Seraphon are also in a great place, but Saurus Guard are like one thing that you just never see, and it'd be cool if you saw them sometimes, and I think they need to drop 10 points to make that happen. Skaven are so weird because they overall power level wise are fine, but the internal balance is just so awful. So the big stuff needs to come up in points a little, and some of the little stuff needs to come down. The really bad little stuff. So that's why I only picked, in my opinion, the four worst fighters, or the four fighters who need the help the most. Out of Skaven to kind of just give small buffs to, and then the four worst leaders. All the Skaven leaders, of course, overpaying for that nerfed ability, so just helping out some of the ones that are overpaying the most for it. Slaanesh Sybarites. No one takes that faction. We have no idea how good they are. I've actually played a decent amount of them. I think they're sort of very average among factions, but they have a lot of these very medium, mid-roll, mediocre fighters, and so I think to get people to play them a little more, I think you've got to drop the points on a lot of the sort of Mirmadesh and Simbaresh to get them to do anything, and then maybe drop the points on the Shard Speaker, who has that kind of interactive ability that could be interesting. Slaves to Darkness are already really good, so I didn't want to make them too good, but I focused here on actually these are the ones that have the really pretty new sculpts. This is something that I think a lot of people accuse GW of in like kind of a tinfoil hat territory thing, but that can be, I think, a little counterproductive. But if I were GW, that's what I would do, is I would encourage people to play the sculpts that I think represent my company best on the table. I would absolutely have the coolest models be the most points efficient models. I think a lot of people accuse them of dropping the points on really ugly models to force people to take them. That is something I would not like. That is pretty cynical if that's something they do. I cannot confirm or deny if they do it, but I would occasionally drop the points pretty low on just like really cool models that nobody's taking. Like if the points came in too high in the first round, like for example, Chosen are just way too expensive right now, and they have those incredible models, but they're just for what you get. I mean, look at a Chaos Chosen and then look at a Stormcast that costs the same amount, and tell me why this dichotomy is here, right? So if I had released a new kit and sort of the first draft of the points, the first edition that they were out, they'd just been really, really bad, I would absolutely wildly overcorrect on them, because, man, you should be giving people as many reasons to play with the incredible Chosen models as you can. Soulblight Gravelords is no surprise, right? And then looking at this, it's like, let's bring the points up on their chaff, and then maybe tempt someone to try a Blood Knight army at some point, right? I don't think anybody will, but just drop the points, but you can't drop them so low that it's like you're just spamming these guys, right? They do need to stay. They have a somewhat elite profile. They need to stay somewhat elite, but they really need to come down a little. And then finally, we have just some changes to some bespoke warbands that kind of gives them a little bit more to play around with from a list building perspective. These are all, I mean, Spire Tyrants are pretty good, but you would never play Pit Veterans in like a really tuned up Spire Tyrants list. And so just trying to help maybe some of the less tuned up lists succeed a little bit more. And then, these are ones that are just not seeing a lot of play and are just really difficult to use right now. They're just really awkward in terms of how their points work. I think Splintered Fang just really needs something to change, and so bringing Serpents down to 80, giving another good Venom Blood. They have one Venom Blood that's pretty good already. I think it's the Whip and the Blade. So having the one that's just the Whip also come down a little kind of gives you a play style there, right? Now you can be like, we are long range, 3-inch range Splintered Fang, and we're going to be, using our ability to make it so we melt through armor and you don't blow us up quick. Or you could try to do the serpent combos again, kind of do either or, and that would be give you something to latch onto with Splintered Fang. The Tarantulas Brood ones aren't that different. I mean, they just kind of need a rework of their profiles to figure out what they're supposed to be, because they are all about this combo where you're comboing this, 50 something point model that you don't really want to be spending dice on 50 point models. It was a lot better when you were spending dice on 65 point models that for some reason cost 35. That was when Tarantulas Brood in first edition was just completely broken. But that was not so much the interesting abilities that was good about them. It was the ridiculous efficiency, and then you have interesting abilities. Now it's this weird thing where it's like all of their abilities ask you to throw dice away towards a really awkward stat line fighter. And so they're just like in this kind of broken place. And so you can make them a little more playable by dropping some points on some stuff, but they're still kind of in an awkward zone right now. And I think they need to be rethought a little, and maybe even some of the abilities changed. I don't know. Tzeentch Arcanites are this they're very average. There's no saving acolytes, but at least with Zangors we can make things a little more interesting where the upgrades to the basic Zangor become a little bit more interesting to use, and that kind of would give Tzeentch a lot more options and a lot more ability to actually have some bite on some of these missions where right now they're just very mopey once they get to where they're going, and that can be a little bit tough. So that's kind of everything, kind of looking at this faction by faction of what I changed. Probably unnecessarily long amount of time, but hey, I got some energy, and we'll see how much of this I keep. I obviously am having a very irregular posting schedule because of my new baby, but I still love doing this. I still plan to be, picking things up once my life calms down a little. I want to be posting every week the way I used to, but that's going to be another couple months before I can sort of be that regular. So until then, I mean, may all your rolls be crits. I absolutely plan to finish my lists for every faction. I still have not mailed the prizes for the painting competition because everything went crazy in my life, but I am actually looking at the prizes right now. I have purchased them. I just need to put them in the mail. So I'm so sorry to the winners, but you will get your prizes very soon. So that's all I've got, and I already said it, but may all your rolls be crits.